This episode of Writing Excuses has been brought to you by our listeners, patrons, and friends. If you would like to learn how to support this podcast, visit www.patreon.com/writingexcuses. Season 20, Episode 13. This is Writing Excuses.
First person.
I'm Mary Robinette.
I'm Dan.
I'm Dongwon.
I'm Aaron.
And I'm Howard.
And we are beginning today a small cycle of episodes in which we're going to talk about the lens of proximity, how close you are to a character, and how much you get to know about that character's reactions and motivations and so on and so on. We're going to begin today by talking about first person. First person feels as if it might be the most natural way to tell a story because that's the way we talk about ourselves. Though obviously the other persons that we will discuss in future episodes are also and equally useful, just useful in different situations. So I want to start by asking, what is first person good at? What kinds of situations do we love first person? What does first person do well?
I think the direct address to the reader, the aside, where it's like, this is what I'm thinking. This is how I'm feeling in the moment. It's not just about the internal thoughts. The thing that I found that first person can do that kind of nothing else gets to is, hang on, let me just explain this one thing to you.
Mm-hmm.
So that kind of direct address of here's some exposition, and I think one of the things that it has is that it immediately connects it to why it is important to the character. And that is sometimes harder to surface things.
One of the things I love about first person is it's a thing that you can do in text, in prose, in a way that's incredibly difficult or artificial to do in other media. You can have first person asides, like the aside in theater being, or a soliloquy, and you can sort of fake it in film through voiceover and things like that. But in a novel, you can have it in direct access into the interiority of a character in a way that you can't in almost any other medium. So there's something really special about the ability for prose writers to use that first person perspective, to say explicitly, here's what the character is thinking, here's what the character is perceiving. And when you want to root someone very much in a subjective, unreliable point of view, first person is the go-to in your toolkit.
Well, that unreliability is so fun to play with, too. Talking about this direct aside to the reader, you could do that in third person, but in first person, it feels like there's no artifice there. It feels like you're getting it much more directly. But, of course, there's artifice there because you are telling this through some other person that you've invented. It's the first person. It's not actually me. It's John Cleaver or whoever I'm writing about. And so there's still a lot of artifice. There's still a lot of kind of artificiality about it, but it feels truer. It feels more direct, and that allows you to be unreliable and shaky and shenanigan-y.
I also think it creates a feeling of intimacy, or it can create a feeling of intimacy between the character and the reader, because it's like the direct aside. It's like somebody has sat down and said, okay, I'm going to tell you something. I'm just going to tell you, the reader, this thing. And nobody else in the story will understand how I feel about this at the core. Nobody else will know my internal thoughts except for you. Mm-hmm. One of the reasons I love writing in first person is because you can really lean into the voice in a way that I think third person can do, especially third person where it's very close. But it doesn't have that quite the same feel as like a friend sat down. And part of what I'm trying to do as a writer is to capture that friend's voice and how they would tell the story in a way that nobody else could.
There's something really, really interesting about first person because it is both our oldest form of storytelling, because just the way that we tell a story is, I was walking down the street the other day, I was going to the store, dog jumped down the street, and I chased after it, right? Like that is just how we tell stories and the way people have told stories as long as they were telling stories. But as a literary convention, as a part of the novel, it's one of the newest forms, at least in a dominant way. Like there are examples that go back, but in terms of being so dominant in terms of how it exists in the contemporary novel is very much a thing that arose in like modernism, like early mid 20th century, right? And so one thing that I see people struggle with when people push back against first person, which I still see kind of a shocking amount, but when I see that pushback, there's like an artificiality to first person that can be a tough hurdle for some readers to get past, because you're reading a text, but the text is being told to you as if a person is narrating it. So who is narrating it to you in that moment becomes a question in certain readers' minds. So there is both an incredible immediacy, intimacy, and familiarity to first person, and a layer of artificiality that requires one extra jump for the reader.
And that's weird, because I will accept that there is magic and spaceships and vampires, but I'm really struggling with the fact that there is a book.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's not so much that like I can think of a bajillion examples of first person, because the novel would often start when you're looking at the trajectory of the novel as a travel log.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
And then you're looking at Poe, who often used first person.
It's like, where does epistolary end and
Right, exactly.
first person begin is the distinction that you and I are drawing here. But
Yeah, exactly. But I think the thing is that one of the reasons it fell out of fashion is that people started to get hung up on but really, did they have time to write this while they were being dragged away by eldritch horrors?
Yes,
Yeah.
always yes.
At what point in the story is this account being given? Well, and I like that you mentioned the kind of newness of it. It is first person is going through a huge renaissance right now in certain corners of the market. A lot of booktubers, bookstagrammers, book talkers. There's a big trend going around, I see, where they will just flat out refuse to read something unless it's in first person.
Huh.
And that's obviously not everybody, and it's not the whole market, but it's kind of having a heyday right now, which I think is really interesting. I want to ask the question, what is first person bad at? As long as we're talking about it, what can you not do very effectively with it?
Clarity.
Avoid the capital I.
I think first person, it can be harder to truly communicate to the reader what's happening in a complex scene, because you're anchored to one perspective and one understanding of what's happening in a particular moment. So there's an immediacy to that. But when you think about your subjective experience of a large event, you're not getting the full picture because you're only seeing a little piece of it, right? So I think we think of firsthand experience as the most true, but in a lot of ways, the way we consume information about what happened is somebody explaining from multiple perspectives. And so when you're limiting yourself to one POV in a story, you are removing access to a lot of tools that you would have in cinema, for example. If you think cinematically, all the things the camera sees are not what the character's actually seeing. What the character's seeing is very different, right? So you're much more constrained. So if you want real, true, like grounded clarity about feelings, emotions, what happened in a complex scene, first person's pretty tough to make that happen.
Your multi POV ensemble cast, heist thing. Yeah, that's difficult to pull off in first person.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's also, I think, first person. You can cheat when we get to third person. You can cheat to show us what a character looks like, even when you're in tight third person.
Mm-hmm.
But when you're in first person, unless they stop and have the mirror moment, which, I was walking down the hall and I stopped to regard myself in the mirror. I had curling red hair and bright green eyes and was extremely buxom.
A thing that everyone thinks about themselves. I'm extremely
Exactly. Just in that tone. But I agree that it like clarity is part of it, and also just knowledge. Like the characters, a lot of times you have like what the reader knows and what the character knows. And in first person, they are the same, because now there are ways to cheat out of this, but in general, you only know what the character knows about the world, about the situation, about the experience. And so if there's something that you really need, like description, self-description, the reader to know, but there's no reason for the character to know that, you're going to have to figure out a workaround. Even in Unreliable, like one of the things I really like doing in pieces with unreliable narrators is setting up a reliable outsider that can be established, like because they hold a position of authority, or you see them being reliable in several scenes and can point out through dialogue or through their own actions what's happening outside of the character's first person experience. They can then misinterpret what that reliable person does, but the reader, it's clear enough to the reader like what happens. I think about a scene I wrote in my story, Wolfie Things, where the mom is crying and the son misinterprets it that he's like, she's trying to salt the food with her tears, like, because no one's going to do that. Like, no, you as a reader know, like, that seems unlikely. Probably she's just crying over the soup, but he cannot accept that. But because it's something clear enough to the reader, it comes through, but it requires a lot of work to do that. Whereas in a third person, you could probably just say like, she crying, and then you would know.
Yeah.
You can cheat that also with chapter bumps. You insert, in-universe material that appears at the top of the chapter, and then the first person account either accounts for that or doesn't account for that. And that can argue with the character just fine.
All right, let's take a moment here to pause, and when we come back, we will discuss this further.
Hey, guess what? The 2025 Writing Excuses Cruise is over 50% sold out. During this week-long masterclass, I'm going to be leading writers like yourself through a series of workshops designed to give you the tools to take your writing to the next level. Space is limited, but there is still time to secure your spot. We're going to be sailing out of Los Angeles from September 18th through 26th. Regardless of where you are in your writing journey, this event is your opportunity to learn new skills while exploring the beautiful Mexican Riviera. Whether you're revising a story, reworking a character arc, or revitalizing your plot, you'll leave more confident in your current story and bolstered by a new set of friends. Join us on board at writingexcuses.com/retreats.
All right, so we've talked about things that first person does well and does less well. Let's talk now about how. How can we use first person effectively? What are some good tools for using first person as a perspective?
So I'm going to talk about one of the traps of first person as a way of bringing us around to an effective tool. One of the traps of first person is navel gazing. So it is, I think, one of the things that it does really well is that you can get into the character's interiority, but you can like have a character just sit in a room and think about themselves and never move on. So for me, one of the tools that I often try to use when I'm doing that to combat the navel gazing is that if I have a scene where my character needs to think about something for whatever reason, I try to pair it with an activity that is somehow plot related. So like if this is a conspiracy, I think a conspiracy theory thing is happening, I will have them trying to repair a rover. And then as they're repairing the rover and having conversations, different things will then trigger for them. It's like, I think you just said something very fishy and what's going on with your face right now? But it is having that interaction with the outside world keeps my my navel gazing to a minimum.
Yeah, it's the multi-sensory approach. Only saying what the character is thinking about is just the navel gazing. But I'm thinking about this. I'm seeing that. I smelled this. I heard that. I'm touching this. My heart is pounding, or I have a headache. There's a whole the huge spectrum of senses that you can tap into with first person. And if you don't use at least 3 of them, I feel like you're leaving too much unsaid.
A tool that I really like to play around with first person is cadence. What the rhythm of that person's thoughts are as they're driving things, because it tells you about the emotions. One thing that's really, you can have a very self-aware first-person character, but a lot of times they're not sure what's going on exactly. They're afraid, but they may not say like, I am afraid right now. They may just be experiencing fear. But what you can do is go with a faster cadence all of a sudden, like breathing heavy, like the heartbeat racing when you're afraid. They're noticing things that are fearful, but also the entire cadence of the piece has that sort of taut feeling to it. And then when there's safety, the cadence slows down and it gives a completely different feeling without you needing to signal it from the outside.
I will say that that is something that is extremely apparent when I am doing audiobooks. When I'm narrating and the author is thinking about that, it shows up on the page, and you can really hear it. And it is much easier to
Probably
act.
makes your job easier.
So much easier to act. I actually think that that's one of the reasons we're seeing the surge in audio in first person narrations is because they do better in audiobook. But there are times when I have to narrate something and the writer has not paid attention to the cadence, and attempting to get the emotion into that scene is significantly harder, even though you have the added layer of I can do cool things with my voice. It is undercut by the cadence.
One of the reasons, Mary Robinette, that your first half of the episode mirror scene was so humorous is that it broke the true cadence of first person. That is not the pattern that you would use. That is not the cadence of, at least not of my inner voice when I look in the mirror.
No,
my
mine
inner
is.
voice. Well, and I mean, I'm not saying mirror scenes are bad. I will look in the mirror, and the cadence for my mirror scene is, Howard, you going to go outside looking like that?
Yeah.
Yep. And then I'm off. And now the reader has an insight into how I feel about how I look and how much I care. And that's all we need.
Yeah. Yeah, most of my mirror scenes would actually be, how did you sleep on your hair to get it to do that?
So if we are using first person as a lens, let me rephrase. If we're using proximity as a lens, this is how we want to look at our work. And what are some of the reasons we might choose first person then? What is going to guide us? I guess this kind of comes back to the question we asked in the beginning of what does first person do that the others can't? But what are some situations where we will say, you know what this really needs is first person?
I mean, it's so intimate, right? And, we're talking about proximity, right? And first person is, you're right up on that perspective. You're in their head with them. So when you need anything that is raw emotion, right? It's why it works so well in YA, why we see it there so much. It's why you see it a ton in what I think of genres of the body, right? So, humor, romance, erotica, and horror, right? Like, horror in particular, first person is just so valuable there because as a person is experiencing disruption, fear, sensations in their body, all of those things are stuff that you can get to so quickly and so closely at first person that can take extra work when you're having to do the work of third person limited or omniscient of describing a broader scene, right?
Yeah.
And so I think whenever you want to tap into someone's like emotional, subjective experience, first person does so well for that. And I think that's why it's doing so well on things like, Book Talk right now.
When you've got a plot reveal, that moment, first person can do that so well because we are right there. And the revelation of whatever it is, the plot twist, the monster, the whatever, the reader is getting that reveal at the same time. The character is getting that reveal at the end. Yeah, immediacy and proximity. And as a writer, that lens of proximity, you may choose to look at your reveal specifically at the reveal you have in mind and say, you know what? This is going to work better in first person than in anything else I can do. So maybe that's the way I need to shape the rest of the story.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that a lot of times I think of first person stories as stories of perspective because you're choosing to use that character is the lens into the story more than anything else because you are filtering everything through the way that character experiences things. And so choosing it when you're going to have a reveal that shifts that character's perspective, where they understand something they didn't understand before, that they couldn't understand before, is where it really appeals to me, where there is a reason in which that person as a filter is the best filter for the story.
And that ties into one of my absolute favorite things that you can do with first person that you cannot do with any of the others. And it's the proximity thing, that you can have the character changed by the act of telling the story. Like some of my favorite stories are ones, it's one of the reasons I love the John Cleaver books so much, is that John is not the same person at the beginning as at the end. And the way John is relating to the reader has changed. And that is so, I think that's so interesting. It works really, I think it's really, really well in coming of age stories. I think that's one of the reasons we often see first person paired with younger protagonists, because you more commonly have a coming of age story with them. But it is something that is just so delicious, so intimate.
Yeah. I know that we are kind of running up against the end of time here.
The end of
all, not necessarily all time, but the end of our time for this. I
As
do
I
want
was
to get
sitting on the
back
couch,
to.
Dan told me that I was running up against the end of time. I paused to look in the mirror.
Are you really going
This is part
outside
of the
like
lens
that?
of where and when.
Exactly. At least I'll look good during my final
So
moments.
I do want to circle back to unreliability, because not only that was something we mentioned not only as a strength of first person, but it's one of the things that is one of the downsides of first person. It's not necessarily a downside, is that it's really hard to not be unreliable with it. What is the value of an unreliable narrator? This isn't really an unreliable narration episode, but it's so closely linked to first person. And you were talking about the John Cleaver books. That's leaning so heavily on that, the idea that what he is telling you is what he thinks is true, not what is actually true. And that dramatic irony of being able to listen to him talk about himself and know, oh, dude, you are wrong about so many things. What is the value of unreliability, and why might a reader, an author, choose to put that into their story?
I mean, going back to several episodes to goals and motivations, right? A character's goals often involve them lying to themselves a little bit because they think they want X, but what they really need is Y, right? And so the movement from understanding what your original goal was to what your new goals are is one of that unreliability coming to the fore as you realize that, like, oh, my understanding of the world is shifting. The reason why first person is sort of inherently unreliable, because character growth necessarily changes what is quote unquote real for the audience experience, right? And so you're shifting, which is both what makes first person so fun and so challenging, is that it's always already moving around you at all times.
There's the idea that we talk about periodically, what is the lie the character believes? There's a bunch of different forms that takes, but I think one of the things that you can really play with in first person is that you can reveal character by what the character is lying to themselves about, and how they are lying to themselves, and the lengths that they will go to preserve those lies. And that's something that's, I think, much easier to do in first person because of the navel gazing, but because they can do a soliloquy in ways that a third person character really can't. And then that in itself can become a form of conflict as they are struggling with the fact that all of their reasons are breaking down.
I call that narrative parallax, because the slight shift in perspective, lets you reveal more.
Something that just occurs to me as you ask this question is that the reason, because I love unreliable narrators, like my favorite thing ever. Really? And I think it's because I like characters that don't necessarily change or grow, which means that the forward momentum in the story has to be the reader realization of the truth of who that character is. And so, like, if they're not, like, because if they were doing, they externally sort of do the same things, but they understand more about the world, you understand more about them, it grows in context as opposed to in action. And sometimes I think unreliability works well because it feels like you're moving forward as they continue to misinterpret the world, even though they don't do anything differently. It still gives it a sense of a forward lean in the reader's mind.
I think two of my favorite examples of unreliable narrators are in first person, are books where you don't realize until the very end that this is a single POV that has been telling you a story in multiple POVs. The fifth season and Player of Games by Ian Banks, fifth season by N.K. Jemisin, you discover late in the stories, oh, this story has a first-person narrator who was part of the action, and they've been lying to me about their involvement the whole time until the very end. And that's not really a first-person narrative, and maybe that's a segue into how we mess with proximity later.
Well, now we finally have arrived at the end of time. So it's homework time. What I would like you to do is go pick up a book that you love, something that you enjoy. Find a scene that you think is really great that is not in first person, and take a crack at rewriting it in first person from the point of view of one of the characters in it, and pay attention to what types of changes this requires you to make, how information comes across differently.
This has been Writing Excuses. You're out of excuses. Now go write.
Writing Excuses has been brought to you by our listeners, patrons, and friends. For this episode, your hosts were Mary Robinette Kowal, Dongwon Song, Aaron Roberts, Dan Wells, and Howard Taylor. This episode was engineered by Marshall Carr Jr., mastered by Alex Jackson, and produced by Emma Reynolds. For more information, visit writingexcuses.com.